hear more about the work done by the UNHCR in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, as well as in other parts of the globe, where the question of refugees is of major concern, not only for IFC member countries, but also for the international community at large. After Mr. Khalifa's presentation, I hope we could have a lively discussion on different issues related to our lecture today, is entitled Islamic Philanthropy in the High Commission of the High Commissioner of the UN for Refugees and the Sustainable Development Goals. But before giving the floor to Mr. Khalifa, and with his permission, I would like to dwell a little bit on the mandate of the UNHCR in general as a prelude to our lecture of today. So the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and his office is really broad. So this office forms a multilateral intergovernmental institution established by the UN General Assembly in the wake of the Second World War on 3rd December 1449. It's principally mandated to provide international protection and humanitarian assistance and to seek permanent solutions for persons within its core mandate responsibilities. The office's original core mandate covered only refugees, that is, all persons outside their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and who, as a result, require international protection. However, over time, UNHCR's mandate has been expanded to cover returnees and stateless persons. So although UNHCR does not have a general mandate for internally displaced persons, it has been involved, so to speak, in certain circumstances to enhance protection and provide humanitarian assistance. In terms of other functions of UNHCR, it is basically interested in carrying out various activities in different zones where refugees are present in relation to assistance. So it's provided, for example, relief distribution, emergency preparedness, special humanitarian activities, and broader development work. And today, since Mr. Khalifa will target a very important issue, which is the SDGs and refugees, we are very excited to hear his thoughts about this very interesting issue. For our audience, when Mr. Khalifa is done with his presentation, please, if you want to ask any question, raise your hands or write your questions in the space specified for this. Without further ado, Mr. Khalifa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. I will continue in English, and if you allow me to share the screen. Actually, I've been spared the introduction about UNHCR and its mandate. So I will go straight into the topic. As we speak today, the numbers of people of concern to UNHCR, refugees and internally displaced people, have reached an unprecedented figure. We are talking now about 82.4 million people worldwide between refugees and internally displaced people. But as I always say in my speeches and lectures, it's not the figure itself. It's not the 82 million, though, if you put those people in one country, if you consider them as a country, this country will be bigger than France, will be bigger than the UK, and will almost be the size of Germany or Turkey. So we are still talking about a huge constituency, but it's not the mere or the sheer number that matters. It's how this number is distributed. and the demographics of the number. 40% of this total are children, and this is almost double the usual situations. Also, those people who are displaced in millions, they do not all go to the West. They do not go to advanced and rich countries. 85% of this total live in low and middle income countries, where those governments and the countries that generously host refugees, they have their own domestic issues, and they have infrastructure problems, and they need to cater also for the needs of the domestic population. If we focus or zoom in on the OIC, the figure is also disproportionately distributed. The 82 million people, 41 million of them live in the OIC region. That's 50% of the total. Though the OIC, if we take it by number, represents in terms of membership about 25% of the world. So the OIC region is actually hosting double its fair share when it comes to refugees and IDPs, but also most of the refugees and IDPs are also coming from the member states of the OIC. The 82 million people are divided into categories, and this is important to note. 26.4 of them are refugees, but not all of those are under the mandate of UNHCR, because this number includes 5.7 million Palestinian refugees, and the remaining 20 million are non-Palestinians. They fall under the mandate of UNHCR, which leaves us with 48 million people who are internally displaced. As we mentioned, 86% of the total are hosted in developing countries, and the number of children is increasing year by year. It increased 1 million since we made the last report in 2019. If we look at the right side of the screen, you see also that there are countries that are producing more refugees than others. The top 5 producing countries or ethnicities, Syria accounts for 6.7 million refugees, and we are talking about refugees only. An equal number of Syrians are also displaced inside the country. Venezuela is a new situation. It's less than 4 years old for us. 4 million people. Afghanistan, 2.6, South Sudan, 2.2, and Myanmar, 1.1. And from this figure, you can see also that those refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and the Rohingya population still represent the majority of the caseload of refugees, and all of them are living in member states of the OIC. Something to note here is that refugees do not stay in a country for a year or two. They sometimes stay for decades. 70 years now, the Palestinian refugees are living outside of their country, more than 70 years actually, since 48. The Afghani refugees who are living in Pakistan and Iran, we just marked 40 years of their displacement. Somali refugees in Kenya and other parts of Africa, 30 years. The Syria situation, we now are going into decade 2. So more than 10 years over the beginning of the Syrian conflict. And these are generations. We are talking about the generations of people who are born in displacement. Some of them grow up in displacement, and some even die in displacement. And this is a very scary fact. How does this relate to the SDGs and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? If it is difficult for countries to achieve the SDGs under usual circumstances, you need to think of the situation of the refugees. It becomes 10 times more difficult. Take, for example, poverty reduction, which is one of the main, it's the first Sustainable Development Goal, and it is something that the international community has been grappling with for many, many, many years. If it is difficult to raise the standard of living for people who are in their own country, nationals of their own country, it becomes super difficult to do that, achieve that for people who are displaced or people who are living in another country that is not their own. In many, many places around the world, refugees cannot open bank accounts, let alone being creditable. They cannot get loans from banks. They cannot open projects. They do not have access to the labor market. They do not have proper access to healthcare. They do not have proper access to education. And all of those are under the Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to health, poverty reduction, education. All of that is very difficult in a displacement context. Even the impact on the environment, which is another Sustainable Development Goal, displacement has a direct link to deteriorating environmental conditions. And we have seen that clearly in the case of Bangladesh, for example, where the Rohingya refugees were destroying large sections of the forest, and we were calling for alternative fuel sources, encouraging donors and countries to invest in providing liquefied gas and providing other more environmental friendly types of fuel in order to protect the environment. So overall, the situation of refugees is completely different from the situation of people who are living in their own countries when it comes to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the last point in that slide, which I moved on from, was actually COVID-19 and pandemics. The way refugees receive pandemics and disasters is much more exacerbated than the way people living in their own normal conditions receive the same problems. Refugees do not have proper access to healthcare. They cannot afford social distancing. They do not have enough protection equipment, and they do not also have access to vaccination programs, which is understandable because the countries where they live themselves also do not have proper access to vaccination. So what applies to host communities in low-income countries apply to the refugees who live there, but in also a different manner. If we look at the situation statistically in the OIC region, according to a report published by the Organization of Economic Development, the OEDC, 21% of people living in the OIC countries are living under the poverty line. 28 out of the 57 member states are classified as low income or countries who are suffering from food deficit. If you translate that into numbers of people, that gives you 224 million people. 50 OIC countries are classified as fragile states, and this is according to the Fragile States Index of this year. And 3 out of the 6 top worldwide fragile states are coming also from the OIC region. This makes it a no-brainer to think of Islamic philanthropy. The Muslim world is not poor and actually is not and should not be fragile. The size of the Muslim economy is $2.3 trillion, according to estimates in 2020, and is expected to reach $3.4 trillion by the end of 2024. That's in 2 years. We have tools in Islam that should guarantee social solidarity. And we have seen periods in the Islamic history where no poor people were found in the whole Muslim world to receive Zakat during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And then they started to use Zakat for social support to help people get married and so on. I do not know about any religion in the world where finance is as detailed. Islam has a very sophisticated financial system, from tools that deal with day-to-day business and trade to tools that address social solidarity. We are talking about musharaka, al-murabaha, al-mudaraba, al-istizra', al-istisna', so many tools that can be utilized in economic development, sukuk, and so on. And if we move to social philanthropy, the tools that can address social problems, Zakat is a tool that does not exist anywhere else. According to the estimates of the Islamic Development Bank, we are talking about more than $500 billion of Zakat assets that should circulate in the world. And the figure goes up to $650 billion per year. This is probably the most generous estimate that I have seen. We have seen other estimates that go down to between $300 and $400 billion per year. Our own estimate in Unhcr is quite conservative. We estimated the amount of Zakat that should circulate in the world at $75 billion. But even though with the most conservative estimate, the $75 billion, this is double the amount that we need for humanitarian assistance worldwide. What is required for humanitarian assistance in 2021, according to OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is $35 billion to assist 140 million people. But Zakat alone, according to the most conservative estimate, is 75 billion. That's double what is needed for humanitarian assistance in the Muslim and non-Muslim worlds. And this is one tool only, Zakat. If you speak about Awqaf, it's a completely different story. And Awqaf has always been a source that supported government budgets in the Muslim history since the time of the Prophet. We have Awqaf in the Muslim world that are not even accounted for. They are not known where they are or how much they bring in revenue and so on. If you move to al-sadaqat, it's an open field for social assistance. And then you have al-qard al-hasan, you have sukuk, you have so many tools that the Muslim world can capitalize on to achieve better equity and to deal with social problems. In Unhcr, we tried to experiment to prove to the world that Islamic philanthropy is a model that can be replicated in other religions. And we are now exploring other faith-based programs in Christianity, for example. But as I said, I haven't seen any religion where finance and the philanthropy is as sophisticated and as detailed as in Islam. We tried from 2013 to research the idea of doing Islamic philanthropy, The idea matured in 2018. That's when we launched the program. But in the at the interim between 2013 to 2018, what did we do? We prepared the infrastructure, and we explained to the organization that we are getting into a system that is 14 centuries old. We cannot ask the system to adapt to us. We need to adapt UN regulations to suit Islamic philanthropy. And that's exactly what we did. We introduced procedures that are quite unique to the UN system. We obtained fatwas, which is also something new for the United Nations. We have now 11 fatwas that permit the collection and distribution of zakat through UNHCR, including fatwa from the International Islamic Fiqh Academy, Majma' al-Fiqh al-Islami, under the OIC, another fatwa from Al-Azhar al-Sharif in Egypt, and a fatwa from the Egyptian Fatwa House, and a fatwa from Canada, a fatwa from Malaysia. And we covered, I think, most of the Muslim world when it comes to endorsement. Then we moved into the financial side. We convinced the organization to open an interest-free account so that zakat money does not mix with other sources of income, which is also something unique and not easy in the UN system to achieve. But we have now a dedicated interest-free account where zakat money is collected. The third challenge that we achieved, and I think it was the most difficult, is to convince the organization to waive administration fees. So we waived the overhead 100%. Zakat income comes $1,000, let's say, we distribute $1,000. And we do not charge anything on zakat money. We actually subsidize the distribution of zakat from our own sources. In some countries, the distribution cost us, and this is a realistic figure, up to 15%. But we cover that from other sources to make sure that zakat goes in its entirety to the beneficiaries. In 2019, that was the proper first year of implementation, we raised $44 million from zakat and non-zakat. In 2020, and this was a very difficult year because of COVID-19 and the economic recession and all of that, alhamdulillah, we raised $61.5 million. The majority of it was from zakat and the rest sadaqat. And we are hoping in 2021 to reach $67 million. This money helped 2.1 million people, 2.1 million beneficiaries in the Muslim world, and 13 countries. So $61.5 million helped 2.1 million people in 13 countries. All of them are OIC member states. This is the link between zakat and the SDGs. I do not need to explain it. I think it's, again, a no-brainer. If we provide more zakat to the poor, we help achieve the first goal related to poverty reduction. Zero hunger is the same, that's goal number 2. Our research and our surveys indicate that more than 90% of people who receive zakat actually spend this money on food. They take the money to eat, and this is normal. If you are hungry, you definitely think of satisfying your nutrition needs and your family's food needs before anything else. And then you move to health, which is goal number 3. A large portion also of zakat beneficiaries spend what they receive on healthcare. They actually wait for the contribution to come in order to undergo a surgery or take a child to a hospital or buy medicine that they cannot buy for chronic diseases and so on. So the link is very also organic between zakat and hunger, zakat and health, zakat and poverty. The same applies to education. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has pushed about 400,000 children, refugees, out of schools. And we do not expect 50% of those to go back to school, especially girls. And this is a very sad reality that children needed to leave school because their parents couldn't afford education, or because they couldn't afford to study online, or because they needed to go to the labor market. Zakat can help resolve part of that problem. Then economic growth, number 8. There is a very clear link between what you spend in cash and the growth of the GDP in those countries, in any country actually around the world, including rich countries. So if you inject more cash into a market, you reinvigorate the market, people take the money, they go to buy and sell and make economic movement that contribute to the growth of the GDP. We conducted a study in Lebanon, and we proved that every dollar spent on cash assistance, including through zakat, actually contributed $2.1 to the local GDP. It cannot get better than that. Partnerships, the last goal that we think we are contributing to, we cannot work in this sector without partnerships. We worked with so many partners during the year, including the religious establishment, including the OIC, our long time partner, including the Islamic International Fiqh Academy, other member states and governments in the OIC region. And we thank all of you for your cooperation and your belief in UNHCR. I think it is a success story that deserves to be replicated and deserves to grow. And I hope, inshallah, one day we will be talking billions of dollars, not millions or tens of millions of dollars, in assistance that we can channel to poor communities, especially in the OIC region. I stop here and pass the floor back to you, Doctor. Thank you.
So much, Dr. Khalifa, for such enlightening, really brilliant presentation. You know, I mean, here in OIC, we are very much concerned about the situation of refugees in member states, basically, and in other parts of the world. We know the plight of these refugees, and we know the root causes, and we know how your organization, Unhcr, works hard with international partners and different stakeholders to come to assistance, or to the rescue of these people who have been displaced or driven out of their countries for different reasons. So my first question, and I here ask the audience if they have any questions to either raise their hands or to write in the space specified for questions. My first question to you, Mr. Khalid Khalifa, I mean, you mentioned in your presentation that more than 50% of displaced populations are from OIC countries. Wow, this is a very interesting figure for our organization and is indeed a major source of concern for us. So what are the perspectives of getting this situation a little bit improved and moving these people back to their homes? And are there sufficient resources to get this huge task done? I'll start with these questions. I have a bunch of other questions, and then hopefully there is more interaction from the audience.
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking, because if we do not deal with the root causes, problems will continue to spread and grow. Unfortunately, what is causing displacement is mainly related to political conflicts to armed conflicts, and that's why they take a very long time. Most of the situations that produce displaced people, whether refugees or internally displaced people, are actually related to political problems in countries. And I mean, it's no secret to say that if you think of the Syria situation, the situation in Yemen, the situation in Afghanistan, the situation of the Rohingya refugees, all of those are not humanitarian problems. They are political problems with humanitarian implications. And we as an organization, as UNHCR, we need to deal with the symptoms until the international community deals with the root causes. The root causes require member states to reach political solutions, requires the Security Council to reach political solutions, but we are calling and we are working with governments to enable return, for example, when return is possible. When return is dignified, everlasting, and secure, we work with governments to enable return. We have been working with the government of Afghanistan, for example, for a long time to encourage return to Afghanistan and provide incentives to refugees to go back to their own country and try to help also build the infrastructure back home to make the return more sustainable. But again, we need to continue dealing with the symptoms until there is a solution to the root causes.
Very good. Well, this I cannot agree more. I mean, the UNHCR role is not to solve international conflicts. It's basically to sensitize the international community to the importance of tackling the root causes of the refugee situation. And of course, UNHCR does not intervene, I mean, in terms of conflict resolution or peace building or reconstruction in the international arena to reduce wars and tension. That's not part of its mandate. It's not part of its job. So this leads me to another question. Also in your presentation, it was interesting to hear that the figures, when it comes to OIC countries, like 50 OIC countries are classified as fragile states. And this is really very much alarming when it comes, of course, to we know that most of the refugees happen to be in this part of the world because of the wars, like we mentioned Syria, Yemen, Libya, with also the aftermath of the Arab Spring and all these events that have basically changed the map of this region. So can you comment on this? I mean, the fact that 50% of these OIC countries are fragile states, and also in some part of your presentation, you mentioned that 6 out of the 10 countries that are, I mean, most poor, so to speak, and almost have resources, have to deal with this issue of refugees. How do you, I mean, from your position as the representative of the UNHCR in Gulf countries, how do you see, I mean, this dilemma? How do you deal with it in your, I mean, daily interaction with the refugee situation throughout the world?
And the question is twofold, Doctor. The first part is related to the Fragility Index, and this is not ours. And I am equally alarmed and annoyed by the classification as you are. But I felt out of academic honesty that we need to share the result of this report. It's not a UN report. This is an international think tank that ranks governments and countries around the world based on very specific criteria to reach a fragility indicator. And they classified almost all OIC member states, with the exception of 7, as countries who are fragile, which means they might face major problems related to their economy or their political situation. These are the two main indicators that they used for this assessment. It is something to be aware of. We do not need to agree or disagree with the index. It's just out there, and we needed to share it out of transparency. When it comes to our own classification of 6 out of 10 countries in the OECD, that's based on numbers. That's based on an objective quantification of the caseload. If you divide the numbers, you will come out with this 6 out of the 10 most pressing situations from the OIC region. So it's just based on numbers of displacement.
Well, of course, I accept this disclaimer. I mean, you disown, I mean, this number. It's not you who classify fragile states. That's interesting, because I saw it in your presentations. I wanted to make clear that it's not you who classify states as fragile, not fragile. Just for our audience. My next question take me to Islamic philanthropy per se. I mean, how do you manage, I mean, the strains in funding your programs and the subsequent consequences in refugee camps, like food shortages, security, child education, capacity building for women, protection of the elderly, and these issues that really, we take at our hearts, so to speak, when it comes to the dramatic situations where refugee people live.
UNHCR is voluntarily funded. Most of our contributions come from our member state donors, from government donors. Our budget in 2021 is about $9 billion to assist this huge number of people that we referred to. But what actually comes in, what we receive every year, is about 50% of that. 50% only of the required budget, which means we either assist 50% of the people who need assistance or provide 50% of the services to all the people who need assistance. This is a very difficult call to make. That's why we are in a regular prioritization exercise on a daily basis. How to prioritize assistance, how to prioritize people who need to be resettled, for example. This is a very good example. How many slots do we have per year to resettle people? We're talking about 100, 110, 120,000 slots. But look at the numbers we are talking about. We are talking millions of people who need assistance. Resettlement is the last resort, but we are under pressure from so many refugees who would like to be resettled and who are coming to UNHCR on a daily basis asking, when is our turn? Why I have not been given a chance to go to the States or Europe while the other person got a chance to go. We need to organization every day based on vulnerability, because the resources are limited and the opportunities are even more limited. And that's why we are thinking of innovative finance, innovative sources of income, including Islamic philanthropy. Last year, private sector donors paid to UNHCR $530 million. And that is also an unprecedented contribution, including Islamic philanthropy, that's part of the 530. And we are hoping by 2025 to reach 1 billion from individuals, from donors and companies and businesses around the world to reduce our dependence on government donors. Sometimes we need to respond to local priorities, which affects their contributions.
Very good. I mean, before going to, I have two questions from the audience, but before going to that, I want to ask you, Mr. Khalifa, don't you think that it is a dilemma, a real dilemma, I mean, to talk about SDGs and refugees, given their fragile situation? How can you develop this concept of sustainable development goals while we are talking about people who are in fragile situation, who suffer with the primary necessities of life. I mean, shelter, food, school, classrooms for their kids. So, can you, I mean, reconcile these two, I would say, conflicting concepts? I mean, development and being in a refugee situation.
You know, in English, we have a saying that you are trying to build the plane and fly it at the same time. That's exactly what we are trying to do sometimes. We know that talking about SDGs in the context of displacement sometimes sound even ridiculous because people are not in a place that allows for development and for assistance, but we cannot ignore 1% of humanity. You know, 82 million people are more than 1% of humanity. It's 1 in 95. If we do not continue talking about their place in the development agenda, about including them, about making sure that they are part of the discussions when we speak about poverty reduction or education or health, they will be totally forgotten. So what we are doing is making sure that refugees are included, for example, in vaccination programs, that certificates that refugees bring from their own countries are accepted in the national education system in the country of residence, and so on. I think the only way to make sure that refugees do not become completely at the bottom of the scale when we speak about the Sustainable Development Goals is to keep talking about their needs as a very vulnerable section of humanity that is not small. And that is our approach to find alternative, creative ways to bring them up to the same level in the future.
Very good. I will move to a question from the audience, which is related to the Zakat fund. One of the participants in this lecture asked, can the UNHCR Refugee Zakat Fund spend Zakat money on non-Muslims?
Non-Muslims. Yeah, I saw that question. It's a very interesting question. It's a question that many people ask around the world, actually. The fatwas, the religious opinion that we have, say that we can give zakat to non-Muslims under al-mu'allafati qulubihim صنف, as they say. And this is the fatwa that we received from the International Fiqh Academy, from Al-Azhar, and from others, that we can give a portion of zakat to non-Muslims under the category of al-mu'allafati. However, we do not need to do that at this stage because UNHCR distributes annually. Our cash distribution program is $400 million. $400 million. If the figures are consistent, we need at least $200 million to assist Muslims, those people who are displaced in the Muslim world. But we raise $50–60 million only in zakat. So even if we use the whole amount of zakat that we have on Muslims only, we still need about $140–150 million on top of that to assist those the rest of the Muslims. So we haven't reached that problem yet. If we start to raise $1 billion per year, for example, from zakat, maybe we can discuss it.
Well, it's a question of resources, as it is clear. Within the same vein, I mean, you talked about this refugee zakat fund, which is the impact of which is very interesting in terms of the number of beneficiaries, as you have mentioned, and the funds being raised. My question to you, before going to another question from the audience, can you elaborate a little bit on this, new instrument in fundraising, so to speak, and how you see the future of Islamic philanthropy, given the multiplication, so to speak, of zones of tensions and this, enforced displacement of people and the different crises. Of course, when we talk about refugees, I'm not talking about people displaced from their homes because of violence of war. The new trend today is the migration related to climate change. So in Africa, for example, I mean, there are a lot of causes, natural causes, so to speak, desertification, lack of water, sometimes, flooding, sometimes earthquakes, other parts of the world. So these are pushing more waves of refugees and migrants to move from their countries of origin. So how do you see the future of Islamic philanthropy and especially of the Refugee Zakat Fund given these huge challenges ahead?
I think Islamic philanthropy is the future. To say it in other words, I think really Islamic philanthropy as a model is the future to be replicated even in non-Muslim contexts because it is a very workable model. It has been tried and tested so many times over and over again. Islamic philanthropy and Islamic finance, even the Islamic banking sector is the fastest growing system in the banking structure worldwide because it is based on equity, it's based on real assets, and it is more just than normal finance mechanism. So I think Islamic philanthropy is the future because it's also very sustainable. Zakat is something that comes every year and can help you deal with recurring problems every year. Awqaf is a very sustainable way of creating income and providing sustainable finance to interventions, and so on. Yesterday, there was a very interesting tweet from the executive director of the World Food Program, David. And I have to refer to it because it's no, it's not 100% related to Islamic philanthropy, but he wrote to the richest, one of the richest, he's now the second richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos. And he said to him, and you can go back to the tweet and see it, Mr. Bezos, last year during COVID, your high net worth increased by $65 billion. 10% of this increase only, not the entire wealth. 10% of this increase only can help us cover all the food needs in the world. All the food needs in the world. And then he wrote another tweet addressing the 2,000 billionaires in the world. You know, we have more than 2,000 billionaires in the world. And he said a small fraction of your wealth can help us cover all the food needs of the poor in the world. To apply this to zakat, that's exactly what we are saying about zakat. If the wealthy people in the world pay their 2.5%, we are talking about a huge resource that makes sure that no poverty exists in the and as Sheikh Sha'rawi used to say, if you see a poor person in the Muslim world, then you should realize that there is a rich person who stole his right, because zakat is a right. It's not a charity. It's a must. It's farida. So I think Islamic philanthropy as the model is the future, and it will help us deal with a lot of problems. How we are doing it, and that was part of your question, we are dealing with two types of constituency: the high net worth individuals, rich people who can give a large amount of money in one go. And we are working also with individuals, small donors worldwide, those people who can donate $100 here, $200 there, $1,000 here. This year in Ramadan of 2021, Alhamdulillah, we raised $10 million in Ramadan only. And again, in a very difficult year, We are using applications on hand phones to help people make the donations easier, and the future is better technology to ensure crowdfunding.
Very interesting. I mean, really, I really commend the efforts you have been making. I mean, because this is a very innovative instrument, so to speak. I mean, you know, raising money for refugees is not an easy task, so to speak. I mean, you mentioned it, a lot of more than 200 billionaires like around there. If they give a small portion, thousand. I mean, if they give
billionaires.
a little portion of their wealth, I mean, the world would be a better place, so to speak. Let me go back to one question from the audience. It's from a participant called Nassim Mahmoud. It's in Arabic. I read it to you, and we have the translation service. ما هي معايير تعريف اللاجئ بحسب أنظمة المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة لشؤون اللاجئين؟ وكيف تتعامل مع اللاجئين في داخل حدود الدول؟ والسؤال الثاني، هل للمفوضية أي جهود سياسية في المساهمة لوقف مختلف الأسباب التي تسبب كارثة اللاجئين؟ وأعتقد أنك I mean you have responded to this question before, so we leave it to the first part of the question, which is the criteria, I mean, to identify refugees according to the UNHCR.
It's an important question. A refugee, from the legal perspective, is a person who left his or her own country and escaped to another country. They must cross international borders to move to another country out of fear for their life, or to flee with their own children, seeking security out of persecution, out of social pressure, whatever. But they need to leave their own country and cross international borders. If they remain within the same country, so moving from one governorate, for example, to another governorate, they are considered internally displaced, IDPs, internally displaced people. And the number of internally displaced people far exceeds the number of refugees. It's almost double. We said there we have about 26 million refugees and 48 million internally displaced people, because not everybody has the luxury or the chance to cross international borders and go to another country. We do not deal with people inside their own countries as refugees, and I think that was what the question was insinuating. If, for example, I receive an application from a national of a country to be considered a refugee in their own country, it doesn't work, because it conflicts with the legal terminology and the definition of refugee. We can provide assistance, but we cannot give them the status of refugee.
Thank you so much, I mean, for this clarification. Another question from Amjad Musa, who is a member of the, staff with us here at the OIC, is asking, and I think this question is not really relevant, because I wonder whether you have a response to it. It's rather an internal question. Did the OIC General Secretariat took part in obtaining the International Islamic Academy fatwa about the Zakat? So if you can answer this question, it will be better. If not, I mean...
No, I can. So thank you, Ustaz Amjad. Good to have a question from you. Yes, 100%. The General Secretariat facilitated the endorsement from the International Fiqh Academy, and I mentioned under partners that we couldn't have reached this conclusion without solid partners like the OIC and its member states, and all our thanks go to the Secretariat and the ICHAD, the Humanitarian Department, for always being there when we need them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My other question is related to something you have mentioned so far. I mean, a lot of refugees basically complain about the criteria of those who seek asylum in Western countries. What kind of criteria do you adopt, I mean, to choose those people who could benefit from this right? I mean, to avoid criticism or this, I mean, complaints about favoring one population than another. So how do you deal with this issue?
There are 20 countries in the world refugees resettled who accept to resettle refugees, and most of them, if not all of them, are actually in the West. They're Western countries. The numbers of slots, or the number of slots, is quite limited, as I mentioned. And the number of applications is huge, millions of applications that we receive. We have to prioritize based on vulnerability, because we receive a lot of applications also from people who would like to deal with us as a travel agency. They think that, I mean, we can just, and they come to complain, why can't you take me to the US? I mean, we are not a travel agency. I mean, you are not going there for tourism. We have to conduct a very thorough assessment of the case. We do a lot of interviews, but it doesn't end there. Even if we consider the person a refugee, it doesn't mean that they will be resettled, because governments, countries that receive them have their own process. They do their own interviews and they have to accept. What we do is to refer the cases. For example, if I receive a Syrian very vulnerable refugee or a person who's applying, and we consider them as refugees and we give them the certificate and everything, or a Yemeni or from any country, and we submit that request to Germany. They might accept it and they might refuse it. And we have cases where we submitted applications or referrals to 3 or 4 countries. And every time it is rejected, we refer it to another country and another country until one accepts. So the process is quite stringent and is not easy, and it depends on the willingness of host countries to accept them. In the past, for example, it was not very difficult to refer medical cases, people who have very difficult diseases. But we are seeing resistance now from Western countries because these cases do not add to the economy, of course, there, and actually makes it difficult to provide them with assistance because they need a lot of care. They need a lot of medical attention and cost and so on. So there is a pushback on severe medical cases. But what do? We are not a country. We have to get the permission from a sovereign country to accept those people, regardless of the difficulties we face, and we keep referring on a daily basis.
So until we have a new question, I have a question for you, Mr. Khalifa. I want to have your take on something that is a little bit conceptual. It's related to definition of migration itself. You know, Western countries call the waves of people coming from different parts of the world to Europe illegal migrants, while non-governmental organizations, I mean, supporting the cause of migrants, call them irregular migrants. So where do you stand in these two definitions? What are your take on this nuances, so to speak, in defining the migration phenomenon per se?
It depends what legal framework tools you believe in or you use. If you use the International Declaration of Human Rights, for example, 48, you adopt the irregular term because all migration is legal, so, or lawful, not legal. If we actually, the Arabic terminology is clearer than the English. Some people call it al-hijra غير النظامية and refuse غير الشرعية because they believe that all immigration is shari, is legal from the humanitarian and the human rights perspective. It's not nizamiya, which means that it didn't happen according to the acknowledged way of traveling. It didn't happen with the permission of the country of immigration and so on, but it's still lawful from the human rights perspective. And it depends what part of the equation you adopt. And seeing more and more employment in the West and problems in the West, it is expected to see a pushback, or the pushback to continue from far right groups in Western countries. And we keep advocating on the other side of the equation. Every day, we call upon Western countries to allow migrants to land and not to push them back to where they came from, and to deal them from a humane perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important issue. I mean, when we talk about the readiness and the willingness of Western countries to host, I mean, so to speak, the migrants, it's a very difficult issue because, I mean, for some Western countries, and I don't want to mention names here, I mean, the reduction in the number of successful irregular sea crossings seem to be the key performance indicator for these countries. And this is really very much shocking, so to speak. So are there any means or ways you use to convince these host countries that, I mean, according to statistics, most of the displaced refugees, people who fled from wars or for different reasons, are in developing countries. Most of them are either in Africa or in Asia or in this part of the world, the Middle East. So the portion of the people who succeed to go the extra mile and move beyond the Atlantic, I mean, to go to Western countries is really very minimum, so to speak. How do you, I mean, use this in your, I mean, daily contact or argumentation, so to speak, or
Yeah.
convincing material when talking about the Western host countries?
We mentioned the top 5 producing countries in the world, producing in the sense of producing refugees. But the top 5 recipient countries, who receives the most numbers, the biggest numbers. Turkey is number 1. They have about 3.6, 3.7 million refugees. The only country, the only Western country in the top 5 is Germany. Germany is number 5 because they have about 1.2 million refugees. The majority are Syrian refugees. And I think the key word in what you mentioned, Doctor, is convince. We have nothing more than advocacy in this context, because we are talking about sovereign countries, sovereign governments. There is no way to force them to open their borders. We have to speak to them and appeal to pressure groups in those governments, in those countries, to keep the borders open, at least allow for humanitarian access to people who are coming by sea, because pushing them back is a direct threat to their life. Not only when they reach where they came from, but they might die in the journey itself before they arrive back. The High Commissioner and our Assistant High Commissioner for Protection are in regular discussions with European countries in particular, because that's where the largest problem is, because people do not go all the way to the States or Latin America. We are talking mainly about the Mediterranean, the movement in the Mediterranean Sea, where people go from the East Mediterranean to Europe, and then they are pushed back to Libya or somewhere else in Africa. And we are in regular discussions with Europe. And at the same time, we are working on the root causes to trying to stem irregular migration, trafficking, and human trafficking. And we're working with other organizations like IOM and other institutions who also are mandated to deal with this issue.
Very good. I would like to encourage the audience to put more questions, but pending this would happen, I have another question for you, Mr. Khalifa. I mean, this whole issue of migration, refugees, make me recall one important conference that was hosted by the Kingdom of Morocco in Rabat, I think in 2004, which talks about migration and development. And you know, in the international migration discourse in general, most of the root causes of this phenomenon happen either because of a military intervention, Western military intervention, like the case of Iraq and of, Afghanistan, for example, and Syria, given the regional dynamics. Uh, and people, when they talk about these situations, they evoke two major concepts: co-development and co-responsibility. I mean, the rich countries or the Western countries who have been part of this problem, I mean, creating this refugee status, have to share the responsibility of solving the problem. And co-development goes within the framework of the SDGs you have been talking about. So being co-responsible for the dilemma or the traumatic situation of refugees entails, I mean, sharing responsibility in developing, I would not say the countries or where refugees come from, but in these refugee camps, I mean, taking more burden in terms of providing or affording the necessary means to make these refugees at least feel safe, have a shelter, cater for their kids, have a perspective, so to speak, to get out of this traumatic situation where they are. What do you think about these two concepts?
This is exactly the spirit of the Global Refugee Forum. We organized the first Global Refugee Forum in a summit that took place 2 years ago to speak about burden sharing in particular. Burden sharing amongst member states of the United Nations worldwide, encouraging better solidarity with countries that have an unproportionate caseload in their own on their own land, while they are not developed and they have their own issues. We are conducting a senior officials meeting to follow up on the recommendations of the Global Refugee Forum in December this year. 12 to 14 December, there will be a follow-up to the Global Refugee Forum where these issues in particular will be addressed. What has happened to the promises and the pledges made by different countries to either accept more refugees, open borders, provide more assistance and financial concessions to countries that host refugees, and so on. I think it's a very good mechanism to encourage cooperation. Not every country in the world can provide the same level of support. Some countries can accept people, other countries can pay money to assist those who accept people, others can help with the legal framework, and other countries can help with the root causes. They can mediate, they can place pressure on other countries that produce refugees and so on. So there are different angles that can be handled during the Global Refugee Forum and as a mechanism for the Global Refugee Forum. And we encourage all member states, especially from the OIC region, to participate at a senior level and take part in the discussions because the problem is very pertinent to our region.
Thank you. One other question from our friend Amjad Musa. He's asking, is it possible to give zakat or sadaqah, the zakat fund, to specific projects or cause? He said this camp or that. I mean, and is it listed? I'm reading the question. Is it listed or classified and able to monitor the development in this regard? If you you get, I mean, the gist of the question.
I got the first part, which is paying zakat for projects rather than individuals.
I mean, please go ahead, and if you have some.
This is again from the fiqh perspective, is controversial, but modern scholars have permitted giving zakat to fund projects that deal with poverty. They said, for example, you can establish a workshop where you employ people and they can work and generate money, but this is not the opinion of the majority. And until now, it is still preferred to provide zakat in the form of individual assistance and small projects. Again, if we reach a surplus in the future, and I don't know when is this going to happen, and when we have money that is not needed and we do not have enough poor people to receive that money, we can use بالقياس the experience that happened during the time of Omar ibn Abdul Aziz, when he used money to cover social needs like marriages and so on. But until now, the amount of zakat that we receive, and everybody receives around the world, including zakat houses, is very, very small. It doesn't even cover the basic needs of, let's say, 1% of those who need assistance.
One more question, if you don't mind. I mean, I know we have taken so much of your valuable time, Mr. Khalifa. I want to ask you about and when we talk about the crises, especially in our part of the world, I mean, Syria, Yemen, Libya, as I say, and the future of those kids who will be the young people tomorrow, and I mean, how can you give them back hope in terms of creating this, I mean, atmosphere or environment where they can develop their skills and be good citizens, given the traumatic situation where they have either, I mean, they have been in war zones and they have seen horrific things happening in front of their eyes. Some of them have lost their parents in a war or in mass massacring of people in some other parts of the world. So, I mean, how do you work with other international partners, for example, the UNICEF or the Organization for International Migration, or even the OIC and some other organizations, to I mean, to direct this collective effort into providing at least some hope for this, I would call it, lost generation of kids who are in the refugee camps?
Very difficult question to answer. Sorry, it's not difficult to ask, but very difficult to answer. We say 40% of the total caseload are children. For young children, probably under the age of 12, maybe, it is, in my view, easier than the age group that is a little bit older than that, between 12 and 18. Because at least this age group, they can go to school, some of them, more than others, about 65% of them can go to school. But if you go to tertiary education, the university level, only 3% of refugee children, if we can consider them children until the age of 18, can go to university. What kind of hope can you give to this group of young people who are dreaming of a better future, who are dreaming to have their own life, to have their own houses, to get married and build a career and so on, when they cannot even access education or university? It's really very, very, very difficult because it requires so many issues to be achieved. It requires money, it requires access to work and job opportunities, it requires access to universities and access to academic institutions. It requires travel. I mean, how many refugees can actually travel to go to a university and get access to an educational institution in another country, let alone in their own country. So each age group in the children, under the children classification, has its own challenges, its psychological needs, and its problems. And I cannot pretend that it's something easy to deal with. It's a very complicated issue. I think we have already lost generations of refugees during the last many decades. And I hope the international community and all actors in the world can actually pay more attention to this group, because it can also be a time bomb in the future. I mean, what do you expect from somebody who does not have any hope in a better tomorrow?
So, yeah, definitely. You're right. I mean, that leads me to another question, because I don't see any more questions from the audience. I mean, how, as UNHCR, I know this is not part of your mandate, but how do you deal with this issue of like indoctrination, so to speak, in the refugee camps by different groups for different purposes? And also, how do you deal with the returnees? We have seen, like in Syria, I mean, a lot of debate about these Western families who have come to join the so-called Islamic states, and now they are in a very tough situation. Do you intervene in handling this issue? I mean, trying to deal with the countries of origin to allow at least kids and women to go back, I mean, to have a life once again, I mean, starting from scratch, because in these campuses they have been victim of, as I said, I mean, religious or ideological indoctrination, and now that they are stuck, they realize that they have been, I mean, seduced into this horrific situation, and they want to go back to where they come from. And there are a lot of resistance on the part of the countries of origin where these refugees come from, I mean, to take them back because of this indoctrination issue. So does the UNHCR has a take on this very problematic and very complex topic?
I think this particular situation is more under the mandate of other organizations than UNHCR. If you are specifically asking about the children of ISIS fighters and so on, I mean, this does not really fall under the mandate of UNHCR. It falls under the mandate of human rights, about maybe IOM, maybe from a perspective of children under UNICEF, under other entities. But we are not talking about a clear-cut refugee situation. Our role in refugee camps when it comes to psychosocial support and programs on the ground is to make sure that people receive the right information about almost anything that can affect their future, including also human trafficking and the dangers of going to perilous journeys. But also, not all refugees live in camps. The majority actually do not live in camps. They live in urban environments, and where you do not have any control over the issues that you are talking about, indoctrination and issues like that are very difficult to control when people are spread all over the country in urban settings. So I think the issue requires better mechanism to deal with it. The needs come on top of the list to make sure that people have their own needs covered before somebody else covers those needs and uses it as an entry point to indoctrination. That's my take.
Thank you. I mean, as we're coming close to the end of this beautiful discussion with you, Mr. Khalifa, I want to ask you another question. I mean, given your, long-standing experience, you're a seasoned, humanitarian worker. Can you give us your perspective, or share with us your perspective about the future of the refugee movement, at least in our part of the world, I mean, the OIC member countries. Do you see the future as bright? I mean, with some gray areas. Do you see the future as bleak? I mean, with very pessimistic, future, so to speak. How can you picture? I mean, or give us like draw a picture for us on the situation of the refugees in at least the coming like 5 or 10 years from today.
I really do not know how to answer this question, but I can tell you my opinion that if we do not believe in a better future, we are not good enough for the jobs we occupy. And I have to believe that the future will be brighter than the present. That's at least what we are working to achieve. Otherwise, we become frustrated and we ourselves lose hope. And if this happens, I think we will be letting down the people we assist.
Fair enough as an answer. Very last question. I mean, Mr. Khalifa, we need to end this beautiful, as I said, discussion. Very passionate, very exciting, with some good news about refugees in at least, as I said, since we are talking here from the OIC, we are more or much concerned about member states within the OIC. Can we have some good news about the situation of refugees in this part of the world?
The good news is we are really helping people. We have millions of people who received assistance in this part of the world. They could have been in a worse situation without the programs that we implemented. We receive feedback from people who are resettled, for example, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, because our efforts, and I think this is something very beautiful about UNHCR, that you can really see the change for yourself. What you do to help a family can actually change their life forever. So the good news is, until now, we are helping and we are providing hope, and there are millions of people who receive assistance every day, and we see and touch that for ourselves, and we will continue doing that. I think to go back to the last question, I think the future will be, inshallah, much brighter than the present. So that's the good news I have. I think we have success stories. We have programs that are working and can be replicated.
Mr. Muhammad Khamlishi seems to have a question. Mr. Khamlishi, you can go ahead and ask your question if you wish. Mr. Khamlishi, do you hear me? Or you can write your question and Mr. Khalifa will respond. Yeah, please go ahead. Can you write your question? We're waiting for our colleague to ask a question. I don't know how to allow him to do this through hand rising. I'm waiting for his reaction. But I mean, until we hear from him, Mr. Khalifa, it seems like you guys are doing a huge job in terms of providing, I mean, a secure environment where the refugee status can, I mean, match the SDGs, so to speak. As we have talked before, it's really a very tough dilemma to reconcile, so to speak, because people who live in fragile situations who are vulnerable, I mean, building their capacities in different fields is not an easy task, especially if these people I mean, live in despair and hopelessness. I mean, to convince them that there will be a future for them tomorrow is really a tough duty, so to speak, or a tough task to carry out. And you know, for example, the crisis in Syria has basically been there for a long time, and a lot of people now trying to go back to their homes as the hostilities, so to speak, or the degree of the hostilities has lessened a little bit. So we don't know when the right time would come for all these refugees to go back home, especially in the case of Syria. But we know that other refugees, like from Libya, or from Yemen, or from Afghanistan, for example, they face, I mean, very tough and you know, dramatic circumstances that basically keep them in this situation of vulnerability. So, do you entertain any kind of dialogue or direct contact with the countries of origin of these refugees in the countries that I have mentioned so far, in order to facilitate the return of the refugees to their I mean, homelands, especially that the burden is really huge on some countries. If we speak, for example, about Jordan and how, I mean, the millions of Syrian refugees that they host, and also about Lebanon, and given, of course, the resources they have, I mean, the scarcity of resources to speak to cater for these huge numbers, counted millions. So what kind of, I mean, strategies do we adopt, so to speak, to entertain this discussion of, as I say, I mean, or to keep this dialogue, I mean, two-way dialogue open with these countries of origin to facilitate, as I say, the return of these refugees back home?
We are in regular discussions with countries of origin where return seems to be possible to any degree. But from our perspective as UNHCR, any discussion about return must have certain elements, must have certain criteria before we can speak about return. And the first of those is voluntary return, that we are not talking about forcing people to go back to their country, even if seemingly the situation is relatively better. That's number one. Number two is the sustainable return. We have seen in Myanmar, for example, the same people were displaced 3 and 4 times in the past. So if you are talking about people returning to a situation where they fled from, we need to make sure that this return will be permanent. The third is about the availability of resources and infrastructure. You are not going to take people from a crisis situation to send them to another crisis situation. So you are moving them from a rock to a hard place. The fourth and most important element is safety and security. The places of return must be secure enough so that we are not sending people back or encouraging them to go back to a place where their life and well-being is threatened. And we are in regular discussion with countries around the world. We have return programs in a number of countries, including Afghanistan, because we had a lot of discussions back home about the areas of return, and we even provided incentives to Afghani refugees who were living in Pakistan to go back to Afghanistan and start a new life. So if the conditions for return are conducive, of course, we encourage it, and we encourage people to consider going back to their country as long as it is voluntary.
Very good. One last question, if you don't mind, Mr. Khalifa, from our colleague, Mr. Mohammed Khandishi. His question is, do you think, Mr. Khalifa, that we need a multilateral institution, I'm reading the question as it is, between UNHCR and the Islamic world in order to benefit from the Islamic social financial mechanism?
I think the multilateral institution is there. That, in my view, is the OIC. The OIC itself, as a secretariat, is it's the second largest international organization in the world. It represents the member states. It has very sophisticated departments, great human resources. What is required is a clear protocol of cooperation between the United Nations and OIC member states through the Secretariat to capitalize on the power of Islamic philanthropy. And I think I see in the future, inshallah, a big conference to speak about how to tap into the resources of Islamic philanthropy and provide a model to the world that can contribute to solving social problems and contribute to social change.
That's a great tip. Thank you so much. I mean, my last, comment here is to ask you, Mr. Khalifa, if you have to call and make, a call to make to the OIC member states on the international community. I mean, from your position as UNHCR representative in the Gulf countries, to either sensitize people to the importance of donating or contributing with Zakat, or to contribute any way possible to the collective efforts seeking to alleviate, so to speak, the dramatic situations where refugees happen to be. So the floor is yours if you want to send a call, to different stakeholders from this.
My message to colleagues on the line, first to thank them for being here and listening to me today. It's an honor. Second is to explain and stress that UNHCR is always a part of the solution, not part of the problem. We sometimes offer unique solutions that nobody else can in the international community to problems that bother governments, and they do not know how to deal with them from a perspective that does not violate international laws. That's when UNHCR can step in and help resettle certain people, certain groups, and it always facilitates our work and puts the government that we work with in better light worldwide to facilitate, for example, our access to detention centers where people are held for repatriation. You have one of two options, either to repatriate them and violate the international law, or to cooperate with organizations like ourselves who can provide a solution that does not violate the international law. The third is a plea to work with us on Islamic philanthropy and help us make this model more successful. I think it has a lot of potential. We are only scratching the surface. There is a lot to achieve in this sector, and we cannot do it without your cooperation, and we cannot do it alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a way of concluding this beautiful discussion, it's very passionate. I know the refugee topic needs like days, not 1 hour and a half, to talk about the work of UNHCR and the difficult situation where refugees happen to be. But allow me, Mr. Khalifa, to first of all to thank you for such interesting presentation and very much enlightening answers to different questions. I mean, I'm sure our audience have come with clear conclusions and ideas about the work that UNHCR does in terms of providing help to millions of refugees around the world, especially in being like creative and coming up with such mechanisms and instruments like the Zakat fund, which is I mean, part of the Islamic philanthropy, so to speak, collective thinking. Uh, so I would like also to thank all the people who have been kind enough to ask questions to enrich this discussion with you, Mr. Khalifa. And if you allow, I mean, if you allow me, there is one more question. If you
Sure.
allow us to ask this last question, if you don't mind. I know we have a little bit taken too much of your time, but there is one more question, and we will finish with that. The question says, is it like again? It's linked to the question that talked about the multilateral institution between UNHCR and the Islamic world in terms of financial mechanism. Mr. Khamnishi asks, I mean, is it a joint multilateral institution? Your answer was, I mean, the OIC is in a better position to act as an intermediary, so to speak, or multilateral institution, but he insists and asks the question whether is it a joint multilateral institution.
And my take on that, that's all my personal opinion. I think we have enough organizations around the world, and we have enough initiatives. I'd rather invest in making existing initiatives and existing organizations work better than create a parallel organization to do what the existing ones need to do. So I think we have enough organizations, enough mandates. We just need to make sure that they are connected and that they work in a more efficient manner.
I fully buy what you have said. I mean, instead of creating more agencies and more organizations, we need just to be smart enough or industrious enough to work with the existing organizations, empower them, providing them with resources, working with them on unified, combined, integrated strategies to face the different challenges that are ahead. I mean, that are facing our fellow humans, unfortunately, refugees, whose I've been like unfortunate enough to be in a situation or another, and I think no country basically is secure from I mean, getting to this situation. I mean, international relations change. Zones of conflict can move from Africa to Asia to Europe and to Latin America or to America itself. So, I mean, it's a human issue that keeps evolving. And as we incapacitate, I mean, these international organizations like the UNHCR, the UNICEF, and other organizations, we are trying to find workable solutions to be ready at least for future crises in case they happen. So once again, Mr. Khalifa, it was really a great pleasure to host you today. I mean, we have benefited a lot, I mean, from your vast knowledge and experience. And we cannot thank you enough for accepting our invitation. And hopefully we can host you some other time in some other lectures within the framework of the Unhcr lecture series.
Pleasure and great moderation, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. We're done.